One quiet Sunday afternoon, a knock on the bathroom door changed everything, and I was not prepared for what happened next. It was a typical Sunday, the kind that lulls you into a false sense of calm. The sun was high in the sky, casting soft rays through the curtains of our small suburban home, creating a warmth that made everything feel just a bit too slow. Sundays had always been my day to unwind, to take a breather from the week and just escape into my thoughts or get lost in a video game. But this Sunday was different, though. I didn't realize it at first. I headed to the bathroom after lunch, planning to stay in there for a while. You know how it is when you're just looking for a quiet moment to yourself. I like to scroll through my phone, maybe play a game or two and just enjoy the solitude. The bathroom had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could shut out the world and take a moment to breathe. Little did I know that what was supposed to be a regular, uneventful afternoon was about to take a turn as I sat there scrolling through my phone. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Our house was always full of little noises, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the TV in the living room. But there was something different about these footsteps, something deliberate. They were soft, but purposeful, stopping just outside the bathroom door, and then came the knock. It wasn't an urgent knock. Air in the house had shifted ever so slightly. I walked down the hallway, my bare feet padding softly against the hardwood floor. I passed by my mom's room, the door closed as usual, and made my way to my own room at the end of the hall. But as I reached for the doorknob, I paused. Something caught my eye. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. My mom never went into my room without asking, ever. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find her standing inside, but the room was empty. Everything was in its place. My bed neatly made, my clothes piled up on the chair in the corner, my desk a cluttered mess of papers and random stuff. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air. My mom's perfume, it was subtle, barely there, but it was enough to confirm what I had already suspected. She had been in here. But why, and what had she been doing? I sat on the edge of my bed, my mind racing. Maybe she had just come in to tidy up, or maybe she needed something from my room. But that didn't make sense. She never did that. And the fact that she hadn't mentioned it when she knocked on the bathroom door earlier only made it more confusing. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why had she come into my room without saying anything? Why had she lingered outside the bathroom like that? And why did it feel like there was something she wasn't telling me? But the story didn't end there. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself replaying the events over and over in my head, trying to make sense of the strange tension that had settled between us. Something was going on, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, and as much as I wanted to brush it off as nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change drastically. The days following that strange encounter in the bathroom were anything but normal. There was a change in the air between me and my mom that I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't like we had a falling out or some big argument, but there was an invisible line that seemed to have been crossed, and neither of us acknowledged it. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, or if I should even try, but the tension, subtle yet unmistakable, lingered between us, almost like it was waiting for something. It started with small things, like the way she'd watch me a little too closely. When I walked into the room, I'd catch her staring only for her to quickly look away, pretending to be busy with something else, or how she seemed to be around more. always finding a reason to be in the same room as me. It felt like every time I tried to carve out some time for myself, she'd show up sitting in the living room when I was there, cooking in the kitchen when I was grabbing a snack, or even folding laundry on the couch when Not after that, she stood up abruptly, breaking the silence that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. "I'm going to bed," she said, her voice back to its usual tone. It was almost like nothing had happened, like we hadn't just crossed a line that neither of us knew how to navigate. "Good night," I replied, still staring at the screen, still trying to process everything. As soon as I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, I let out a breath. I didn't realize I had been holding. My mind was a jumbled mess of confusion, curiosity, and something else I didn't want to admit to myself. Why had I just sat there? Why hadn't I pulled my hand away? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The following days were awkward to say the least. I avoided being alone with her as much as possible, finding excuses to stay in my room or leave the house whenever I could, but no matter how hard I tried to avoid her, there was no escaping the tension that hung between us like a dark cloud. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the couch, the way her hand had felt on mine, the way her voice had sounded so intimate. And then one evening, things escalated. It was late, and I had been trying to finish up some homework. When she knocked on my door, my heart skipped a beat as I called out, "Come in." She stepped inside, looking a little unsure of herself, which was unusual for her. "Hey," she said softly, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she should come in all the way. "Can you help me with something in the garage?" I hesitated for a moment. Being alone with her felt like stepping into dangerous territory. But I couldn't exactly say no, sure, I said, standing up and following her down the hallway. The garage was cold and dimly lit, the only light coming from a single overhead bulb. She led me to a stack of boxes, talking about how she needed to organize them, but her words sounded distant. My mind was too focused on the way the air between us seemed to crackle with tension. As we stood side by side, moving boxes around, I could feel the space between us shrinking. Even though we hadn't moved any closer physically, it was like there was this unspoken pull drawing us together. And no matter how much I tried to ignore, it was becoming impossible to deny. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, and our gazes met for just a second. But in that second, something shifted. There was something in her eyes, something vulnerable and raw, and it made my stomach flip without warning. She stepped closer. Her hand brushed against mine, sending a jolt through my entire body. I froze, unsure of what to do, my mind screaming at me to step back, to say something to stop this. But I didn't move. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. And then in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I've been thinking about you a lot." My heart pounded in my chest, and I didn't know how to respond. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words got stuck in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then before I knew what was happening, she leaned in the space between us, disappeared in an instant, and I could feel her breath on my skin, warm and soft. My mind went blank as her lips hovered just inches from mine, and in that moment, everything else faded away. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but there was no stopping what was happening. Not anymore. The next few moments felt like a blur, as if time itself had slowed down, trapping me in this real space where everything was happening too quickly and yet not fast enough. Her face was so close to mine, her breath warm on my skin, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. My thoughts were tangled, a confusing mess of emotions that I couldn't even begin to sort through. All I knew was that something irreversible was about in there, before her body was against my body, and we were intertwined in each other and lost in that moment. It was different now. more intense. More certain time seemed to blur after that. I wasn't sure how long we stood there wrapped up in each other, lost in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. There was no thinking, no rationalizing, just pure emotion. Every breath, every movement felt like a step further into uncharted territory, but neither of us stopped at some point. We found ourselves on the couch, the soft fabric beneath us, a sharp contrast to the intensity of the moment. Everything was moving so fast, and yet it all felt too slow, like time had distorted around us. Her lips never left mine, and I could feel the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on us. This was happening, and it wasn't something we could just walk away from anymore. But even as it all unfolded, there was a part of me that still couldn't fully comprehend it. How had we gotten here? How had things escalated so quickly? I knew this was wrong. I knew that, but in the heat of the moment, none of that seemed to matter. The only thing that mattered was the way her touch made my skin tingle, the way every kiss and touch sent a shock of electricity through me. There was no turning back now. We had crossed a line, one that neither of us could uncross. And yet in that moment, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something we had been tiptoeing around for days, maybe even weeks. And now that it was happening, there was no stopping it. I don't know how long we stayed there, lost in each other. Time seemed to have no meaning anymore. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. All I knew was that when I finally pulled back, gasping for air, my mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts all at once. But none of those thoughts were enough to overpower the pull I still felt toward her. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions that I couldn't begin to unravel for a moment. We just stared at each other, both of us trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could say anything, before I could even think of the right words, she kissed me again. It wasn't like the other kisses. This one was softer, slower, filled with something deeper, some rushing back like a tidal wave, overwhelming and unavoidable. Everything had changed between us, and there was no escaping it. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. Couldn't act like life was going to just go back to the way it was before the silence in the house was almost suffocating. I stood up and wandered to the kitchen, half expecting to find her there, maybe making breakfast, maybe waiting for me. Like nothing had happened, but the room was empty. The house felt empty, and for a brief moment I wasn't sure whether that was a relief or another layer of tension to add to the pile. I poured myself a glass of water, the cool liquid doing nothing to calm the storm inside of me. My mind was racing, a mess of tangled thoughts that I couldn't seem to untangle. What had we done? What was going to happen now? The questions were endless, and I didn't have a single answer. It wasn't long before I heard her. Footsteps in the hallway, soft but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I turned to see her standing there, her expression unreadable for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with the weight of unspoken words, the tension palpable. "Good morning," she finally said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Morning," I replied, my throat dry, the word coming out more strained than I intended. I wanted to say something more, to ask her what was going on in her head, but the words wouldn't come. Everything felt too raw, too fragile. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing how to navigate the aftermath of what had happened. It was like we were both stuck in a moment that we didn't know how to move past. The silence stretched on each second, heavier than the last. Finally, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking about last night," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying the uncertainty she felt about what happened. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. This was the conversation I had been dreading, and yet it was inevitable. We couldn't just ignore. It couldn't pretend that nothing had changed yet. I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Me too. There was a long pause, and I could see the conf in her eyes, the way she was struggling to find the right words to make sense of something that didn't make any sense at all. I don't know how we got here, she admitted, her voice breaking just slightly. I don't know what any of this means. I didn't know either. All I knew was that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. Neither do I said honestly. But we can't pretend like nothing happened. She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. I know, she whispered. I don't want to. The admission hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with meaning. We were both standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand, but there was no turning back now. The line had been crossed, and whether we wanted to or not, we had to face whatever came next. I don't know what to do now, I said, my voice shaky. Everything feels so different. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. It is different, she agreed, but we'll figure it out. We have to. Her words, though meant to be comforting, didn't do much to calm the storm raging inside of me. There was no roadmap for this, no way to predict what would happen next. All I knew was that we had stepped into something far more complicated than either of us had anticipated. The day passed. In a strange kind of haze, we both went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, pretending to do things that needed doing, but the tension between us never faded. It was like an unspoken agreement that neither stepped into territory that was more complicated than either of us could have imagined. And now we were left to deal with the consequences. The silence of the house wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace.